Yeah, well, the Scottish Government is bringing in new proposals to make changing one's gender easier and quicker. So one of the ways they're looking at doing this is by setting up a fast-tracked and, quote, less medicalised system. So trans people can change their gender without going through what the SNP call a degrading, traumatic and intrusive process, with medical checks and wait periods and much more as well.
However, some campaigners have raised concerns about the SNP's gender recognition reform bill and are worried about the impact the proposed changes could have on women's rights. Well, Miranda Yardley is a human rights activist and joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Miranda. I mean, what do you make of the proposed reforms? I mean, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has cautioned the Scottish Government to look more into this, but they seem to be ignoring the calls from campaigners and actually the equality body in the country.
I think they're probably ignoring many of their own voters as well. It's quite amazing what single-party states will try these days. Yeah. I think the whole concept of self-ID is fundamentally flawed. The idea of women being able to define their own single-sex spaces is an idea that came about simply because women were prevented from participating in everyday life, in public life. And what this type of law seeks to do, it's fundamentally, it is against any ideas of equality and fairness and the dignity of women.
Yeah, well, look, one of the reasons apparently why the SNP are bringing this in, I'm just quoting now, is because trans people, as they say, are among the most stigmatised in our society. Is that true?
Is it heck? Don't be ridiculous. There are plenty of people more stigmatised than trans people.
Yeah, but you
want to see real stigmatisation? Go onto the internet and look at any of the women who write about this issue. And look at the amount of abuse hurled at them, the stigma that they suffer for speaking out. Look at what's happened to J.K. Rowling, a woman who is this country's most successful author, also an incredibly generous woman who's gone out of her way to support people who are less fortunate than herself. You want to see the way that she is being stigmatised.
Well, she's been stigmatised by her own cast members. She's turned these bang-average actors into multi-millionaires. Daniel Radcliffe would be stacking shelves in Lidl if it wasn't for J.K. Rowling, and now all of a sudden he's disowned her. But anyway, I believe you have a question.
Miranda, why do you identify as transsexual rather than transgender? Because I remember, when I was younger, that was the term that people used to describe people that felt differently to their biological sex, but now transgender is the one that is more widely used.
Wow, there's a whole rabbit hole.
Here we go. We've got another hour and a half left on the programme, so crack on.
Fantastic. Well, there you go. The next hour, in fact, we could probably make a 7-part series out of this. I think people kind of, if we go back, I think people have an idea about what transsexual means, and the idea was introduced has been introduced in a number of documentaries. There was a documentary about Julia Grant in the 70s called A Change of Sex. What we saw there was an individual who was being put through a process of counselling. Of course, Julia decided not to go through with the process that was there, but there was a process that people followed, and you went through this idea that what you would do is you would undertake a fairly significant amount of psychological support, and you would go through that process over what really was a number of years.
Yeah, Miranda, just quickly on that, because you just said going through a bunch of psychiatric examination and things like that, and Nicola Sturgeon has described this as
counselling, really, counselling
as intrusive. I mean, do you think that that's important? Because I think that that is quite important to make sure that people are making the right decision. I mean, that they potentially could be going through, life-changing bodily transformation. Isn't it right that we do psychological and ask really tough questions of people to make sure that they're making the right choice, whereas SNP want to get rid of that process?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure there are no bad actors as well.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think if anyone's going to go through this process, then their mental health has got to be in order. There was a statement made by one of the Scottish parliamentarians yesterday suggesting that no one has ever pretended to be a woman to get into women's spaces or take advantage of women, which is a patently, obviously untrue statement. And it really worries me that this whole idea of self-ID is being pushed around so that any man can define themselves as a woman. You know, here we go again, the same sort of thing
Miranda,
with men defining what women...
Do you believe that you can change sex? I mean, because for a lot of people, it's very simple. You know, you have one reproductive function and another is we have a species that's male and female. But some people are trying to really tell people that you can change your sex. I mean, do you think that this is actually possible, or are we just not being honest with ourselves as society?
Oh, we're not being honest with ourselves as society. It's impossible to change sex. We are a sexually dimorphic species. It's how we've evolved. It's how mammals evolve. And what we do is we evolve as a sexually dimorphic species to make sure that the species survives. The whole concept of changing sex is
Miranda, what do we do then? Because this debate has been raging on for seemingly years now. Yeah. It's a back and forth with the SNP, the British government, and there seems to be these two worldviews. You've got one hand, the J.K. Rowling and other radical feminists, and a lot of other people who say, who say, you know, sex is immutable, you can't change sex, you know, we need to protect single-sex spaces. And the other side is self-identification, it's all, you know, a social construct. How do we meet those two worldviews when it comes to legislation then?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think legislation should be based upon measurable empirical evidence and reality. I think basing legislation on the activities of lobbyists, especially abusive lobbyists, is an absolutely terrible idea and a terrible thing to do. I think that as well, that if within this debate we get discussions about diversity and about equality and about respecting other people, and what I see in this is a complete absence of any respect for or any consideration being given to the safety and dignity of women and the privacy that women are entitled to be able to get away from men. And it doesn't just, we need to think about how this is going to affect all types of women, how this is going to affect young girls in schools, how this is going to affect, you know, young girls who are athletes, who want to get involved in sport. We need to look at, we need to see the effect that this has on the most vulnerable women there who are in women's shelters and, spaces to protect them from those who fled domestic violence, those who've been victims of rape. And when we have this really quite perverse situation in Scotland, surprisingly, where I think it's Edinburgh rape crisis is headed by a man who now calls himself a woman, who got the job by lying about his sex in the application process. And to me, the individual's called Myrtle Wadwa. It seems to me the most repulsive type of insult to women. To do that and keep somebody in that type of position who has lied about such a fundamental thing about themselves.
Well, it's classic, isn't it? It's just nothing surprises me anymore. Miranda, can I just ask you something, right? I've actually interviewed you now several times, OK? And you know what? It struck me. I at no point have bothered to ask you about your own experience, right? So can I? So sorry about that. That shows the kind of person I am, I think. But can you tell me a bit about it? Because this particular thing that's happening in Scotland now, for example, would that have been a benefit to you at all in your lived? I know it's not quite the same thing, but don't get me wrong. But would it have been any benefit to you whatsoever?
I think the whole process is of absolutely no benefit to anybody. We still have this law in the UK called the Gender Recognition Act, which the country was made to implement by the European Court of Human Rights back in 2003, 2004. The existence of the law was primarily to ensure that there was no negative discrimination for marriage and for things like state benefits and pensions. All of those problems have gone, and I think that the gender laws, as one could refer to them perhaps, I think these laws are absolutely redundant. We have protections in the Equality Act, and we have equal marriage. The whole concept of people changing legal gender to protect their themselves from negative discrimination is protected in other areas. The law it's redundant, and also it's bad law because what it does is it forces people to pretend something that's not true, and I don't think you can force a population to believe something that's not true. It never ends well.
Well, thank you so much, Miranda Yardley, human rights activist.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sharing her thoughts on the Scottish
Miranda.
move to
She's
fast
a regular.
track the Gender Recognition Act, and we've covered this a lot at GBNews.
Well, it's a bit of common sense, isn't it? You know?
Yeah.
It's quite nice, actually. It's quite refreshing in this day and age. But anyway...